Hi, I'm David Kais, and I run R for the rest of us. You may think of R as a tool for complex statistical analysis, but it's much more than that. From data visualization to efficient reporting to improving your workflow, R can do it all. On this podcast, I talk with people about how they use R in unique and creative ways. I'm joined today by Alison Hill. Alison is the Director of Knowledge at Voltron Data. Prior to this role, she worked in data science and education roles at IBM and RStudio, and she was a professor at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. With a PhD in developmental psychology, quantitative methods, and evaluation from Vanderbilt, Alison has long taken a keen interest in helping people use R Markdown to make their work more efficient, more accurate, and more reproducible. Thank you, Alison, for joining. I'm delighted to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you.
I guess maybe starting out, and this actually wasn't one of the questions that I put on there. I'm curious. I know you've just switched to a new role.
Mm-hmm.
What does a director of knowledge do? What does that mean?
Yes. So Voltron Data is a company that's all about bridging hardware, software, and communities. So the director of knowledge role that I've taken on there is trying to sort of build bridges internally between our different teams so that we can all stay united on the mission. So you can imagine that a startup has sort of a explosive growth of new employees, and that's exactly what we're experiencing, which also means an explosive growth of ideas and also documents. So there's a lot of knowledge being shared, a lot of knowledge that you'd like to have transferred to certain teams and people, and especially knowledge about really highly technical concepts. So Voltron Data is all about accelerating the Apache Arrow open source toolkit. And so we've got some pretty technical people who are working on that and some pretty technical high ideals and things that we're trying to achieve. So I'm shepherding that information and trying to figure out a way and a strategy for us to be able to bring all the employees along for the ride and help everybody be able to do their job better. So trying to rein in some of the systems and the ways that we talk with each other, but also the actual content, like what do people need to know in order to feel like they can talk about what we do as a company and what we're aiming for and our vision and our mission. So it's kind of a broad purview, but it's been really fun. I've been there for about 3 weeks, and I'm still in the drinking out of the fire hose phase.
Sure.
It's been really exciting. It's also, a lot of people on the more technical side who are really committed to open source and community engagement. So I really love that flavor of Voltron Data's mission.
Where does R fit in terms of your current role?
Yeah, it doesn't fit in much in terms of my day-to-day working. So right now I'm doing a lot of kind of knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer in Google Workspaces and Notion, and reading through a lot of materials that have already been created, a lot of resources. But yeah, the company as a whole does have this mission of making it easier to work with big data in whatever language you want to use, using whatever user interface you want to use. So they want to support, right now they're supporting Python and our users through supporting dplyr and lubridate, which are some of the core tidyverse packages. So the idea is that you're able to work with big data wherever it is, and be able to use whatever tools that you want to be able to use. So they really want to support sort of this polyglot workflow, you kind of bring your own language and you can work with the data that you need to. So I really love that part of it, and there's definitely some friends on teams that are working on the Apache Arrow R package, as well as some of the other kind of I think of them as sort of glue software that's kind of helping make those exchanges between R and some kind of big data systems a little bit easier. So there's a few open source projects that are going on right now. Substrate is one of them. dplyr support is a part of Arrow. And then there's also a Python crew who's also working on sort of corollaries to dplyr in Python. So being able to use a Python package called IBIS to be able to interface with data the way that you'd like to. So it's pretty exciting, and it's nice to be able to be in a place where you can really support open source development, but also be focusing on the people at the company who would like to understand all of that, but need it at a level and kind of delivered in a way that's a little bit easier than maybe reading through GitHub issues or GitHub release notes.
Sure. Yeah. One, it seems like the kind of thing that runs through all of your work is one of the things is really being able to communicate effectively and bringing together, different audiences, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
And I've asked you
exactly.
on today because I want to talk about R Markdown, which
Hmm.
is, if nothing else, about being able to kind of efficiently and effectively communicate. So before we actually dive into talking about R Markdown, I'm curious about kind of your background and how you got into R and kind of what switched for you when you did move to R in terms of your work.
Yeah, well, so I got into using R at first when I was a new professor at Oregon Health and Science University. And I got into it because I had done all of my graduate research in psychology. I'd done it all the statistical analyses in SAS, and that's all my courses had been in all SAS. And I really liked SAS. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's sort of like a baby stepping to a command line tool. You are writing out text to be able to interact with data. But it's a little bit different than, working with a programming language like R or Python. And so I used SAS. I was a happy SAS user. And then I joined OHSU and I realized the cost of a SAS license. And the director of the program that I was in said, look, he had come from Bell Labs originally. So that's where the S language was originally developed, and R sort of evolved out of S. So he was super comfortable with base R. And he was like, look, I use R. It's open source. I think you should try it. And at that point, I was in this computational program working at the center at OHSU that's no longer in existence, but it was called the Center for Spoken Language Understanding. And what we did was we trained people who were machine learning researchers and natural language processing researchers to be able to work with medical and health related data, and to be able to use that and use advanced computational methods to be able to derive unique insights about healthcare related issues like children's response to treatments, symptom progression, things like that. And so I started learning R, and I was like, wow, our students could learn to use R to do the statistical analyses that they need to do. So I found myself really drawn to being able to help people do the work that they needed to do their jobs. So I started teaching R for data science at OHSU, and that was sort of like my hook. Like I felt like it had superpowered my workflows to be able to do better research. And then I started using R Markdown because I had collaborators, and my collaborators didn't know R. I was still like kind of that like island R user that I was in a computational department, but everybody else there actually used Python. So I used R, and I was kind of like this lone wolf where I would be knitting my little documents and being able to create things that were shareable, but also create things that were really dynamic. So I could go into a meeting with a collaborator who didn't want to use anything, who maybe was the clinical expert, subject matter expert on my team, and be able to show them like, here's the data, here's what I did with it, here's some visualizations, and we could have really productive meetings where we could iterate very quickly because, the subject matter experts could be like, oh, well, but what if we, faceted by this? Or what if we, looked at the group in this way? Or how is that different if we use this variable versus this variable? And it allowed me to just go into my R Markdown document, edit the code as we were talking, and then, regenerate plots as we were meeting, be able to regenerate tables. And then I'd be able to give them, an actual artifact. Like I'd be able to, knit to PDF or knit to an HTML document that I could share with them. And then they'd have that kind of like in their hands and on their computers so that they could look at it later. So for me, it really supercharged my ability to actually collaborate with other people and not feel like I was kind of doing science in a vacuum.
That's interesting that it supercharged your ability to work with non-R users,
Mm-hmm.
sounds like, as much as with, at least initially, as much as with R users.
Yeah.
I
And,
wouldn't have
as
guessed
I
that,
sort of became
but it makes
like,
sense when you describe it.
yeah. And as I sort of became more of an evangelist, I started training more people underneath me because I wanted to work with, research assistants and graduate students who were using my same tools. So then it was really more fun when you got to have people that, I started teaching classes in data visualization and in data science. And then those people would come to work in my lab with me. And then it was like, really supercharged fun at that point because you could be sharing documents, we were were using GitLab to be able to share our code with each other, but we'd be able to, really quickly iterate and have fun with poster presentations, papers, progress reports, anything where we were consuming the data and trying to get a peek at, what was happening, how our research was going. It was a lot more fun when I had other people who are our users to join in also.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned briefly R Markdown. I'm curious because I always have trouble describing R Markdown to non-R users. I'm
I get
curious,
that.
maybe starting out talking about R Markdown, how
Yeah.
you define it when you're talking to people who are not familiar with it.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think of R Markdown as something that if data scientists didn't have it, they would have had to invent it. Because, if you're sitting there and you're writing your code, you might be surprised as somebody who doesn't, maybe interact with code frequently, or someone who's, kind of only consumed the output of people's code, that a lot of people just use scripts and kind of go line by line and create things, but don't necessarily have a shareable artifact of what they did. And for me, R Markdown was both like a place to do work. So it was kind of an interactive experience because I was using the RStudio IDE, my integrated development environment. So I could kind of run code as I was working. So it allowed me to sort of like code while thinking, so I could write notes to myself and I could try different things and I could iterate quickly. But then also it allowed me to package it up in kind of in a nice little bow and be able to say like, okay, I'm going to basically print this off. It's sort of like a Google Doc print to PDF. It's like I can give you this this kind of fossilized version of my work, and I can also kind of edit that. I can make it, more or less relatable to you. If you don't want to see my code, I can just like mute all my code and just show you my plots, or I can actually use it for teaching materials. So I can actually show you, if you want to learn how to code, you can see my code and exactly what it produced. So it's sort of like that Swiss Army knife element. And I think that's what's tough about explaining R Markdown to people too, is that it's not one thing. It's an R package. It's a file format. It's also sort of an ecosystem of multiple R
Right.
packages, and then you've got like all these kind of different verbs around it and all these nouns about like file formats and packages. So I think it's hard because you can use the word R Markdown to kind of connect with any of those concepts. So I think if you're just kind of on the outside looking in, it's helpful to kind of define it at the different levels. Like it's both a file format, like a .rmd document is what you need to be in, but that's just a plain text document that just has some like special R chunks in it that allows you to include code with real words.
Yeah. And so R Markdown is often referred to as a form of literate programming. I'm
Mm,
curious, well, what does literate programming mean, and
yeah.
what's the value of literate programming?
Well, so literate programming is a concept that was developed by Donald, I believe it's Knuth. No, Knuth, I think. There's a pronunciation on his website. And it was really this idea of being able to weave together this code plus narrative. And I think in the original, kind of like flushing out of the idea, it was really more for programmers to be able to write more literate code. And I think the labeling of it, even I think in some of the original writings, he talked about how he labeled it literate programming on purpose to sort of give it a little bit of a value judgment, so that you don't want to be an illiterate programmer, right? Like you want to be a literate programmer. So it was kind of very intentionally labeled that way. But his idea was that, he ended up feeling like he wrote better code and people that he worked with wrote better code when they were kind of weaving together sort of documentation at the same time. So being able to say, not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it and why you're doing it this way. And I think that sort of filtered down from the programming domain for scientists and for data scientists. So anybody who needs to work with data can also kind of be inspired by that idea and think about like, okay, great, like that's also a really helpful concept for me to be able to, package up my own ideas and work and have it have more of an impact. So I think it's one of those like great programming concepts that makes a whole lot of sense. But I think you and I kind of share this reference, I think, to the curb effect. Like it makes it easier for everyone, to be able to build a system that is more open and accessible to people who are not the person who wrote the code. So the original intention was for one developer to be able to see another developer's program and be able to understand it better. But data scientists have sort of co-opted it and said like, okay, here's actually a way for you to be able to understand, the science that I'm doing better.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one critique that I hear a lot, and this isn't specific to R Markdown, but it's
Hmm.
specific to R, is that taking R takes a while. And
Yes.
so I'm curious, what makes it worth it? And in particular, in what ways do you think R Markdown especially makes it worth taking the time to learn R?
I think it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So, a lot of times when I would talk to new, especially like data scientists or even researchers who are doing academic research science, um, being able to figure out how to talk to other people in your groups is really important. And so, if you are feeling that pain, then I think R Markdown is kind of the best Swiss Army knife solution. It has a lot of benefits for yourself as well, but I think the primary benefits are really being able to jump back into your own code in 3 months or even a week. If you take a spring break and you come back, you know exactly where you left off because you've left yourself a nice little trail, and it goes beyond commenting code. So a lot of people in scripts will just like comment and they think that's enough. But it's really more than that. And it's also being able to explain like your thought process, why you're breaking things down that way, but also like the output itself. Like if you have a plot, it doesn't stand on its own. It really helps to have words around it, like here's what you're seeing in this plot, or here's what I'm noticing and pulling out from this plot. So I think if you're in that place where you're feeling like maybe your work is difficult for you to understand when you come back to it, or if you're in that place where you're feeling like you're doing all this work, but it's not really like bubbling up to the next level of like the people that you work with to be able to appreciate and understand it and give you feedback on it, then I think that's kind of a good sign that it might be helpful for you to think about a way to more easily share it so that people can consume it. And I think, so I think it kind of masks itself in this sort of shroud of like, things aren't quite flowing and collaborations aren't quite happening. What could I do differently? But certainly R does have a high learning curve. I think it's a lot better than when I learned it. I think when I first learned it, there were sort of like the core tidyverse packages were out there, but I don't even think tidyverse as a name was out there yet. So I think it was like was using ggplot2, and I was using some of the dplyr package functions, but it wasn't all knit together. And I think, for me, when I was teaching a lot of beginners, I found that to be a more pleasant on ramp for people, especially people who don't have any background with any kind of coding before. If they're coming from the place of like, I need to do Excel plus, then I think that's a nicer on ramp for
Right.
them personally. I think we might share that ethos, but for me, I think that's made it a little bit easier.
Yeah. I mean, tell me if I'm kind of misinterpreting what you said, but one thing I heard is that in some ways using R Markdown, it forces you to kind of well, not really verbalize, forces you to type,
Hmm.
kind of what you're doing. And in that process can actually help you to get clearer about, what it is that you're doing. Because if you can't articulate it, in your own, like to yourself, then it's obviously you're going to struggle to articulate it to others. So as opposed to just having a script where you're like, oh yeah, I know what this does. But then if you actually are forced to articulate it, you might struggle. Our Markdown basically forces you to do that step of articulating it.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And you can imagine that even if you're not able to actually share like the rendered artifact of, an R Markdown process, which is usually like some kind of static file that people can't really interact with too easily, but they can consume it. Even if it's just like you using it
right.
as an interactive workspace, you can imagine that, especially in today's like fully remote asynchronous work environment, it's so much easier to be able to hop on a video with a colleague, share your screen, and be able to walk them through like, okay, here's where I did, some data exploration. And if they say, well, wait, like, what did you look at missingness or something like that? You can just hop back and be like, oh, right. I can just kind of skip to this little place where I have a bookmark essentially that says like, this is where I did the missingness analysis. And you can say, okay, let's take a step back and talk about missingness first then, and go through that. And then they can say like, oh, but you might have missed that, maybe this participant or this set of participants maybe should be excluded from this analysis because we figured out that maybe the equipment that we were using wasn't correctly calibrated before that, and we haven't let it, get into the data dictionary. Like there's all kinds of different things that you can get from that collaborative
Sure.
experience that are a lot easier if you've got the code and your rationale behind it in one place, so that you don't have like otherwise what you end up having, or at least what I did, which is not optimal, is I had a script and then I had like little files that were describing what each script did. And we're like, okay, this is where I did this. This is where I did this. And then here's some notes about like, oh, this was weird. I should go back and check on this. And then the fusion of those two things, like those never line up again for you. So even
Yeah.
if you're like the most meticulous and paranoid documenter, that is an unhappy workflow.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's actually get into looking at some examples. I pulled this from a talk you gave a couple years ago,
Yeah.
where it was R for Pharma,
Yes. R
and
for
you
pharma.
talked about working with R Markdown, kind of needing to change your mental model. Can you kind of dive into this and talk about what you're referring to here in terms of how you need to change your mental model to work effectively with R Markdown?
Yes. So yes, this is for the R in Pharma conference, and same materials have been presented a few years in a row at R in Medicine too. So for all of those kinds of conferences, typically I'm expecting users who are coming in who are more experienced with creating documents and writing, narratives in like Word documents and Google Docs. So what they're used to is essentially, if you think about it like a WYSIWYG editor, what you see is what you get. Like you're writing, but then you're also able to be like, okay, I'm going to make this bold. I'm going to make this italics. I'm going to be able to type this and then immediately see how it's going to look to the person who's coming up behind me, right? So who I'm sharing it with, I can see it immediately. And when you're coming into R Markdown, I always found this a little bit of a challenge for new users, especially who hadn't dealt with programming before, because all of a sudden now you have two files. So you have the source file, and then you have the output file. And with R Markdown or any of the related tools that are for literate programming, that's the case. So you have this separation between the source, which is where you input, your text, you input your code, and then the output of the code, like plots or tables or results of analyses, those end up in the output file. But like one of the key concepts of why you'd want to do literate programming is that you keep those two things separate, because that's really your link for reproducibility. If you change the source, then you re-render and you get that output. And there's a one-to-one match there where you have like, exploratory analysis.rmd, and then you'll have whatever you knit that to, whatever you rendered that to, exploratory analyses.html or exploratory analyses.pdf. So I think that's just something that is helpful to kind of say at the outset and then keep repeating over and over and over again with people, is that, now you have a source file and you have this output file, and you'll always be having those two files. You share the output file, and you could potentially share the source file if somebody is so inclined. But that's the real benefit here, is that you no longer have just like exploratory analyses.doc where you're pasting in plots from R and you're copying and pasting from this document into that document. The whole point is that you preserve the source and you save the source and you edit that, and then you can re-render when you need to, and that's that reproducibility step.
Yeah. I'll say it took me using R maybe like a year and a half before I realized that R Markdown was a thing. And
Yes.
in the beginning, I was just using it, making plots, and then copying to Word and writing the rest of my report. And it was still better than what I had been doing because I was using Excel, and I just got really frustrated with how much pointing and clicking I had to do. And it took me a bit to realize, oh, I can also go one step further and write the whole report that I was working on in R Markdown, and only then at the end, when it's ready, or at any point along the way, knit it and create my output. So, and I've been amazed too. I don't know if this has been your experience, but I've been amazed how many even relatively advanced R users there are who are not either familiar with or just don't use R Markdown. I've
Yes.
been surprised at how
Yeah.
common that is.
I had the same experience when I first started learning R. I was using R just from the R UI, and somebody told me about RStudio, one of my
Hmm.
students. But I was like, I didn't totally understand that it was free. My mental model of things was that those things were not free, because any kind of software that I used for research you had to pay for. So it took me a while to get on that bandwagon
Right.
first, and then to figure out that RMD was a way to store my files in an easy way, and that was a serious upgrade for me.
Yeah, definitely. So I have brought up an R Markdown document. I'm working
Mm-hmm.
now in the browser using
Mm-hmm.
what's called RStudio Cloud, but same as if you were working. It looks really similar to if you're working on the desktop. And I have opened an R Markdown document that you created for that workshop. So I'm wondering maybe first of all if you can just kind of walk me through a few of the pieces, and I'll kind of scroll along as you do that.
Yeah, and if I can just set it up real quick. So this was a workshop that had a few different segments, a few
Sure.
different blocks. And so what I did was I structured it so that each segment we sort of took like a different phase of a project and had an R Markdown document that we started working from. So this one is more of like a student is coming to us and says that they've done initial analyses, and then the later stages where we use different R Markdown documents to work from in the workshop. We're sort of like the progression of that project. Like we started off with the communication from the graduate student with some exploratory analyses, and then I think we had like a progress report for a grant funding agency, and then the final thing was kind of a draft of a paper. So we were trying to show like the whole life cycle. So this was kind of like your project's first kind of R Markdown, just to show people too that these documents can evolve and change as your project evolves and changes and grows. So do you want me to walk through like the structure of this one? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just starting out, like I'll ask you some questions about individual pieces, but
Okay.
what's the overall structure look like when you're looking at an R Markdown document?
Okay. So when I usually teach workshops, I usually talk about like the anatomy of an R Markdown document. So I believe this one might even be inside the anatomy. Yeah, the RMD anatomy section. So I typically think of the top part as metadata. So that part is, I don't know, David, if you can highlight like the stuff between the three
Yep.
dashes. So that's the metadata for your document, and that's stuff that is usually either in the document title or some of the metadata for a file. If you're thinking about like a Word doc or a Google doc, you'll usually put like a title in there, and you might have the date and your file name, or inside the document at the top to remind yourself of when you wrote it, and you might put like this is by me. So it's a little bit different. We put metadata inside the actual R Markdown document itself, and then when you render it, some of this ends up showing up in different places in the actual output file. But it's a nice way to have it stored in actual text instead of in sort of like various places on your computer, and you can't remember who wrote what or what date you wrote some document. It's always in the metadata block at the top. And so this is a format called YAML, which has got keys and values. So key is on the left and value is on the right. And then after that, you just start talking to yourself and to other people. So you can start writing text, and then you can interweave that with code blocks, which are the gray parts. So you can see that we start off with like a little note from the graduate student, Daniel Chen here. And then he says, this document summarizes the current enrollment in this, mock studies. We use this mock study data. And he inserted some inline code there. So that makes that really reproducible. So if you enter something in the metadata, up in the metadata block, you can actually call on that in the text of your document. So that's one nice thing, is that you're not kind of, if Daniel decided to, oh, whoops, I'm going to resend this on, September 15th, he can only change the date in one place. And then when he re-renders the document, that text will also update. And then, let's say, and we did this in the workshop, the actual data set changes. So you can see on line like 25, we're reading in a data set called Mock Boston. And then at the end of this block of the workshop, we say, oh, wait, we just got a couple more sites in. So we had the Boston site before, and that's the only site we had. But now we have 3 sites, read back in the data and do the same analyses. And so Daniel in the future could go back into this document, change that one line and re-render it. And then everything that you see below that are narratives and analyses that go along with them. And so they're fully reproducible, but also fully updatable. So if your data changes, you change it in one place and everything should flow from there. So that was the intent of this document, was to kind of showcase some of the early things that you might do in an R Markdown document for a project where things are going to be changing and you're kind of planning ahead for that.
Great. Let's talk about kind of each. You laid out a bunch of the different elements.
Mm-hmm.
I think you laid out, talking about the YAML pretty
Mm-hmm.
clearly. So we'll leave that. We'll come back to that in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But Maybe first, if we can talk a bit about text. So this text, with the exception of this right here, which you talked about, is fairly clear. It's text, right? But there are also some things. So for example, here you have summary, and let me even actually open up this. So
Yeah.
this is the output when you knit this. So when you go, hit that knit button. I'm curious though, when you're starting out talking about R Markdown, what are some of the, I'll come back to that maybe in a second. What are some of the things in terms of the text, the Markdown text that you highlight for people? Because it is a bit unusual if you're used to, working in Word, for example, you're not going to use that type of syntax. So what are some things that you typically highlight?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first most useful thing about Markdown is the ability to add headers. So that's what's indicated by that hashtag or the hash symbol. Not a hashtag, it's a hash symbol. And so that is giving you what we call a level 1 header. So the nice thing is when you knit that, it kind of calls out the word summary and makes it bigger. So it's just like in a Word document when you add headings to sections and you want to kind of visually demarcate sections for users. That's how you do that in plain text. And so this is a plain text file. And then, and this may not be there. So now you can see summary there.
There it is.
Yes, and so if you scroll down, I think there might be one more section. Let's see. Yeah, overall enrollment to date by site. So all of these things give your document, kind of easier readability for people to be able to kind of chunk it. You can kind of, you can imagine that reading just a wall of text and analyses and plots is not very easy to consume. So I really think that's a really high payoff way to start organizing your documents. One real useful benefit right now for us to show, David, would be if you show, down at the bottom of that panel where it says like hashtag summary at the bottom. So if you hover in the panel that you're in the .rmd panel, if you hover over the kind of TOC Explorer on the bottom.
Oh, here.
Yeah. So this, especially once you get longer documents, it's a really nice way to explore your document is that you can, if you use these headers like summary, overall enrollment to date, and by site, you can skip around and find those sections really easily. So it's not just for readers who are reading your document later, it's for you to be able to kind of, jump to a different section really quickly and easily, and also just see the overall structure of your document. You can also click on the outline button on the right, David, up at top. And that's just kind of another way to see the same thing. So I think those headers you can do, up to level 6 headers, meaning up to 6 hashes in a row to kind of play with the size and the structure of your document. I usually only use up to 3 hashes, but that's a way to have nested sections as well. And it sort of helps you build out the outline of your analyses and keeps you organized, and also has that added benefit of people being able to see that organization in the rendered document. And what we did, I think, David, the HTML document that's open right now, not the one that you knitted, but the one that you opened that was there.
This?
Yeah. So this one is one where we added some stuff to the, this one. Yeah. So this is one where we added some stuff to the document. So if you change some of the metadata, you can add this table of contents on the left. And so what that does is then it pulls in those headers as well into an explorable table of contents. So now, David, you could click to by site, for example, in the table of contents and be able to see it quickly and jump to that part. So that structure is nice even on its own without those extra things, but you can add a table of contents. You can add some things that build off of it too.
Yeah. And I know when I started learning R Markdown, the idea of writing text with Markdown was kind of odd to me. I had just never done it before. But now that I use it, I asked you to highlight kind of the main things, and you basically talked about like headers and then there's obviously just like straight text, like that overall enrollment includes 3 sites. And I think you can see like once, well, actually you did that in a more complicated way, which we can talk about in a second, but once you get the basics down of working with Markdown, you can, it's really not, again, it looks weird when you start out, but once you get the basics down, it's not that complicated.
And I think that's another kind of mental model shift
So
is like, oh, sorry. I think that's another shift in mental models
no, go ahead, go ahead.
is not using the mouse, you know? So really the philosophy behind working in a plain text document is that everything that you see, everything that you change are things that you can type with a normal keyboard, and you don't have to mouse around and break your flow as you're typing to be able to say like, okay, I want to click on this, I want to highlight this word and make it bold. You can just bold it, you can just italicize it, you can just start making lists, and everything that you see in a plain text document is something you can type. And I think that's kind of a shift also for people, because you're used to having to instruct the app that you're in that you want bold here and you want italics here, but this is a way of doing it by typing. And David, you could also show the visual mode too. I'm not sure. I haven't. This document was prepared pre-visual mode, but that is like RStudio's WYSIWYG editor. Let's see what it does. It might change some things, but this is the WYSIWYG editor, and this was released after I had taught this workshop. But this does give you, this is a way to edit the document, and as you're writing, you can actually see the markdown as it would be, you know, sort of like how it would look in the rendered document. There's still some additional things that would look slightly different, that you could see this difference between this and the HTML. But the idea behind the visual markdown editor is just that you can type markdown and then it immediately transforms into what it would look like, what it's processed as. But then you can also use a point and click method here. So you can see that we got a nav bar up at the top that gives you like bold, italics, header. So this is kind of a nice way to bootstrap your way into Markdown. If you're more comfortable with a Google Docs or a Word type workflow, you can start learning Markdown this way by saying like, okay, here's how I want to add a header. And then you can switch back and forth between the visual and source modes and see what changed in my document. You know, I want to make it a level 2 header or a level 3. So it adds 3 hashtags or hashes. So I think that's a really nice new feature that I definitely really enjoyed teaching with, also for exactly the audience that we're talking about, people who are not familiar with kind of Markdown as a way of writing text that has formatting in the rendered version.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I mean, like I changed that in the visual to a third level header, and it added three hashes. I'm actually old enough. Sometimes I refer to them as pound signs, which I feel like makes me sound really old. But
I know they're hash symbols and
I
not
just think
hashtags.
of old phones, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So we've talked about the markdown in R Markdown comes from Markdown text, and if people Google Markdown text, there are tons of resources that give you information on other things, making things bold, italics, making lists, etc. But the idea with R Markdown is it has both Markdown, the text, but then also R code. So let's talk about code chunks. What are code chunks, and like how do they work kind of as they're interspersed with the Markdown text?
Yeah. So the code chunks are all those gray bits. And if you're using the RStudio IDE, there's some nice little tools that you can use with those chunks. So you can see that you have a little green arrow to the right on each side of each code chunk. That's how you would run the code in a chunk. And so these are ways that you can interact with code in this document. So the text, you write it, you're done, but the code, you write it and you want to see if it works, or you want to see what it outputs. You want to be able to maybe edit the code based on the output. Like maybe you're kind of testing out some code and you're trying to figure out like, is this the right code? Is this what I want to show people? Is this what I need to know? So you type the code in here, and then when you're working interactively, you can run it by using those nice little green buttons, and then send the code to your console and you can see it and then edit the code there. But then also when you click the knit button at the top, that runs everything all at once from the top to the bottom. So it processes the Markdown text and translates what you've typed into what it should look like. And then it also goes and evaluates each R code chunk, and it evaluates the code one chunk at a time from top to bottom. So in the sequence that you wrote them is how it thinks you want them to be run. And so this is really nice for reproducibility so that you can make sure that you understand exactly how the analyses that you've done, like exactly what were the dependencies, what things did you need to do to the data before you made this plot, or what kinds of data manipulation did you need to do in order to get the table to look this way or the analyses to look this way. So that is what the knit button does, is it takes both the code and the text and literally knits them together, so that you have this final output that includes the text, the actual code if you want it to, although it can pretend like it's not there and kind of hide it, and then the output from the code. So like the analyses, a plot, a table, something that you were producing with the code, something that you were having show up, that also ends up getting knit together into the final document. So it's kind of two things. It's both a workspace if you're using RStudio, and it's the ability to create that single document that takes those different elements that you're seeing demarcated here and puts them together in a way that, David, you mentioned there was some text that had code in it, for example. Like you can't even know that from looking at the final rendered version. It's all kind of seamlessly integrated for the person who's looking at it, so they can focus on what you want them to focus on.
Right. So let me actually just I'm gonna hit that button, which will run everything from the top down to this point. And then I'm gonna actually let me take a simpler code chunk. Let me do this, for example. So this code chunk gives I don't even know, a summary of enrollment to date. And so we can, like you said, in addition to being able to hit the knit button and run everything and make that HTML document, you can also run individual code chunks if you want to test things along the way. Down here, for example, just run that and run that. You're creating graphs, so you can like test your graphs. I'm curious, when you're working, how much, when you're using R Markdown, how much do you kind of knit the whole thing? How much do you work on like individual code chunks? What kind of best practices do you typically teach in terms of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, I try to instill in new users a philosophy of knit early and knit often. So a lot of times what you'll see is that somebody will use it as kind of a scratch pad, and use it to develop a bunch of different plots maybe, or, different kind of flows for data manipulation. And then when they go to knit, they're stuck because they've been working so interactively that the code, when it runs from top to bottom, doesn't work. Maybe because you created a new data frame up at, line 15, and then you're trying to, use a variable that's created in that new data frame up at line 10. And that's a mistake. You need it to flow down. So as I'm working, I'm typically doing kind of a mix. I'll be working interactively for a little bit, but always in the back of my head, I'm thinking, okay, I should knit this, make sure it knits. And start looking at how it knits and look at the formatting too, and how it looks, if that's, one of your criteria, if you're going to be sharing it with somebody else. But if I'm mainly using it for myself, I'm mainly just using that as a reproducibility check. Make sure that I haven't introduced any inconsistencies in terms of the flow. Like I haven't made a variable that this plot up above it needs to depend on. So I would probably spend 75% of my time working and iterating on a new document, on a new analyses with a new data set. And then 25% of my time is like every couple 5-minute blocks, I would knit to get that check, make sure it's there, and then keep going. So I think it kind of varies as you're working on a project and as you're working with a new data set, or if you're working on a final, kind of final looking thing, you might spend more time knitting than iterating on code, but it's kind of a balance.
Yeah, and just to kind of demonstrate what you were saying, I'm going to restart my R session, but if I am working in R, and let's say, let me just do that. So I'm working, and let's say I
really
manually run this code chunk. So now I can see I have a by site data frame, and then I go up here, and great, I can make my chart, and it works. And I try and knit, and it's not going to knit. And the reason
Right.
why is it's going to say by site not found. And what you were saying is that that doesn't work because when you run it interactively, in other words, when I'm just sitting here hitting buttons to make it run, yeah, I have by site and I can make it work. But because it knits from top to bottom, that's not going to work. So being able to check it by doing that knitting periodically, I think is very good advice.
And what you just said too is also the other
Um,
key to that
go,
is restarting R also. So making sure that you restart
mm,
R and do that kind of fresh knit. I think that's also really critical.
yes, I agree. Okay, let's talk about. Let me put this back where it was in case I knit again. Actually, let's. Oh, okay. So you do have. I assume this is data from multiple sites. Is that right? The
Yes.
mock BSD. Okay, perfect. Um, so just to like demonstrate the kind of value of our Markdown, you like you said before, you set it up so that you start out with this mock Boston um, data set that or the CSV that you're importing, but there's also a mock BSD. So if I do mock BSD, so I change it this one line and I knit that, I'm going to get something completely new. And I'm wondering if you can talk through like how it is that we now have something. So this chart, for example, before just had Boston. How is it that like changing one line gives us something completely different in the whole rest of the document?
Yeah, I think that's really like one of the best examples of like why should I use R Markdown is that you can have a data set that in the previous data set we just had data for one site, but the structure of the data file was set. And so this happens a lot, especially in scientific research, but also in industry, where you know what the data is going to look like in terms of the column names, what you're expecting to see. You may just not have all the rows yet, and you may not have all the values in a column. So in this particular example, we had this variable called site. So that means site was a column in the data set originally. But in the first data set that we looked at, the only values for site were Boston. So if you had done this analysis when you were looking at the mock Boston data set, you only saw the pink bar here in this chart. So you saw a pretty underwhelming rendered R Markdown document for that reason. But because of the way we wrote the code, you can see that in the ggplot code, for example, we've got the variable site is used. So that means that if site ended up having more than just Boston in it, it would just work. And so being able to write your code, it has to do with how you're composing your code at first, how your data set looks. But if you know that you're, taking a data set as is, and then it's going to be updated or changed, or added to in the future, you can go ahead and write the code and it'll be completely reusable. You just have to kind of plug and play, like set it and forget it. Like once you have the data set, you put it in there and the code will run, things will look different. And that's on you to be able to say like, okay, here's what, maybe building in some code to show you like what's different, in this data set. But now you can see that we have Seattle and Denver. And so we have more data. We also have different data. And so everything that gets rendered gets updated. And that's really one of the great benefits of our Markdown for me is that when I was a research scientist, especially, I would often be in this situation where I'd get data sets kind of flowing into me over time, things slightly changing, and being able to just know that my code would still run and that the final paper that I submitted, the final poster that I wanted to present, the final talk I wanted to give, that I knew that those were based off of the most recent data and that I knew I could go ahead and start working on it before the data was final, because you never know when it's going to be final sometimes in academic research or in most industry settings.
Yeah.
It allows you to kind of build those robust pipelines.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point that you can work along the way as
Hmm.
opposed to, for me, for example, I used to work in Excel and it was complicated to make charts in advance of having the final data because I would have to then just go back and kind of recreate everything from scratch. Whereas as you talked about and we showed here, you can just change one line and all of your graphs and everything, all of your analysis will update with that new data, which is a huge time saver. So one other thing I want to talk about inline R code, but I had put to talk about this one, but I actually, when I was scrolling through, where was that? Where you manually say the number of sites here. So we talked very briefly about this line here, which in our rendered document doesn't look like anything special. It says overall enrollment includes 3 sites. But when I look at it in the R Markdown document, it does not say overall enrollment numbers include 3 sites. So I'm curious, can you explain how this crazy looking line ends up becoming something simple like that?
Yes. So inline R code is one of those things that I find super useful for exactly what we were just talking about in terms of robust reporting. So when you're writing anything and you want to include numbers in the text, you can reference any variable that you've made in the R Markdown document. And that actually includes like anything above it, you can reference that. So that's why I made that variable in that code chunk right above it, where I said saving this number. That's my little comment. So I'm saving that in sites. So that's creating a variable that is just a number, and it's 3 in this data set because we had Seattle, Denver, and Boston. But in the original document, this would have been 1. And so if you had knitted it originally and you weren't kind of thinking ahead, you would say overall enrollment numbers include 1 site, and you might just type that out. If you were planning ahead for robustness and reproducibility and knew that there were more sites coming, you would want to code that and say, okay, however many sites there are, I want to just report that. So you make a variable, and then that R in underscore sites would change. But the problem is if you didn't actually change the language behind that number. So if you just wrote site there, because it would work for if there was 1 site, then your sentence would only be right if there was 1 site, right? So you'd say overall enrollment numbers include 1 site. That would be right, but you'd reknit this with 3 sites, and it would instead say overall enrollment numbers include 3 site. So if you want to have the pluralization that goes along with it, this is kind of a simple way to do it. It looks complicated, but you can build these if-else statements in the R code to say, okay, if that in sites number is greater than 1, then write the word sites. If it's not greater than 1, just write site. So this is a way to start making it so that your full report is completely reproducible. And sometimes this can take time in the text, and it feels kind of like a heavy lift at first. But this is one that has huge payoffs and dividends in the end if you are in this kind of role where you have data that's evolving by just like 1 thing is changing, 2 things are changing. This happens a lot for people. And, you might have monthly reports that need to come out about something, and you just want to be able to take this new intake data and be able to summarize it, make a dashboard, make a slide deck for your, all hands or something like that. And you just want to be able to not look like a fool when you realize that the text has to change also if the numbers change. So this is meant to give people an example of how you can make the text fully reproducible also.
Got it. And I'll just actually put this down in the console so I can see, for example, n sites actually shows up as 1. And let me actually just copy this code. So this if else says if n sites is greater than 1, then return sites plural, otherwise return site. So right now it would return site because interactively the last time I ran this was with that Boston data.
Yeah.
But if I say restart my session, come down to here, run everything down to here, and let me copy in n sites now, which returns 3. So now if I copy in that if else again, it will return sites. So that's how you end up with that dynamic text. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about in terms of R Markdown that you like to highlight for people kind of starting out with it?
No, I think for people starting out with it, my best advice is to not worry too much about if you're doing it exactly right or if you're following best practices or, feeling like you need to get to a place where things are perfect before you can progress. I think the best way to get started is just to pick something where you need to work with data and start trying to use it. And you figure out your own workflows as well. And it's sort of it's a fun rabbit hole to dive down. So for me, that's how I got started. And I think there are definitely learning curves along the way as you go and grow in your R Markdown skills. But just to get the early benefits right off the bat, there's really not much more than what we've talked about today. But I think it's more like what happens after that is where, there's so many different places you can go with it. There's a lot of different paths that people take, and especially if you're in an industry job, knowing that you can go from here to be able to make templates for your teams or for your company that use R Markdown. You can package them up into an R package. You can make slides. You can make multi-RMD books. Like there's all these things that you can do that that really expand the things that you can make. And for me, I think the biggest sort of aha moment that I had was when I gave a talk and somebody asked me, how much different stuff can you do once you learn those things? And I think the answer to that is really more like, I think as you learn this, your ideas start to expand about what you can do and what you can make and what your job actually entails. So for me, being able to start using this tool chain and these toolkits really helped me to be able to grow in my career, to be able to say like, oh, okay, well now we need this thing. Oh, I can make a website, or, oh, I can, make this thing that people can interact with. So it helped me to be more creative and open with myself about things that I could do and make that maybe before I would have just kind of noted them as a problem, but I wouldn't have had any kind of proactive thing to do about them. So I hope that it ends up being an empowering toolkit for a lot of people to be able to think to themselves like, okay, my organization needs this thing, and wow, now I actually kind of have a real concrete idea for how I could make this a better workflow, or a better product that people can consume.
Yeah, I was talking to Matt Herman earlier
Yes.
this week, who made a really fairly sophisticated website on tracking COVID numbers in Westchester County, New York, where he lives. And I asked him, I said, why did you do this in R versus, any other tool? And he said, well, R is a tool that I know. I'm not a front-end web developer, but by using R, and in this case, R Markdown, he's using Distill. He's like, I can do really complicated things that I would not be able to do otherwise. And like to your point, it really empowered him to be able to make something that he probably wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So I think it really does kind of like expand the possibilities for what you're able to do once you learn it. So, and I know, actually, just speaking personally for me, my company does so much parameterized reporting, which
Yes.
I talked to some people at Urban Institute about that, like being able to automate making, dozens or hundreds of reports is just magical, and the kind of
Yes.
thing that you can do with R Markdown that doesn't scale when you're working in Excel, say. So
Yes, definitely. That's a very
yeah,
empowering workflow.
yes, huge. Well, a couple quick wrap-up questions. So I guess the first one is about Quarto. So
Yeah.
Quarto was recently announced kind of as a next generation scientific and technical publishing system, and I'm curious what you see as kind of the relationship between R Markdown and Quarto. I know you don't work at RStudio anymore, but like
Yes.
what you anticipate the future looking like in terms of those two tools and the relationship between them.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I know it's on a lot of people's minds lately because Corto has kind of been gaining in some attention and blog posts, and especially if you're attending Conf this year, there's a keynote about it and workshops now for the first time. So I did work on Corto when I was at RStudio. So I was the product manager for data science communication there when I worked closely with the R Markdown and Corto teams. And I think the relationship between those two ecosystems is incredibly tight, first of all, because Corto is basically, in my mind, taking everything that we all learned about our Markdown and the growing ecosystem of our packages and kind of trying to take like the best practices, lessons learned from that, and make something that was truly integrative that actually was, going beyond R. So allowing people who don't know R, who use Python or Julia now as a supported language, to be able to gain the same benefits that R Markdown gave people. So, I think the overarching problem that Corto was trying to solve is that like R Markdown is awesome and our users have really benefited from it. And we've seen this community grow and we've seen people be able to grow their careers and their skills using R Markdown and grow their own impact as data scientists. But the real crux of a problem that was totally a real pain that a lot of people felt was, hey, I'm teaching, or hey, I'm working with this team, but in order to be able to collaborate with me on an R Markdown document, I have to tell them to download RStudio and install an R package called R Markdown,
Right.
and then use R code. And so Corto opens that up and kind of blows it out of the water and says like, okay, we're going to write a command line interface completely in TypeScript that is not based in R. So you don't have to install R, you don't have to install Python. You can kind of come with whatever tool you want to use, and you can still gain the benefits of literate programming. So it's still very much like an iteration of literate programming. Corto is also completely committed to the Pandoc tool chain underneath the hood. And I think, our Markdown users have kind of been shielded a little bit from Pandoc. And so you may not realize when you're stumbling into different packages that it's using Pandoc or not. So Pandoc is this command line interface that, luckily we don't have to use because our Markdown wraps it up for us. But it does that last conversion step. So when you're picking an output format and in our Markdown document, like we were knitting to HTML document only here, for example, but I mentioned PDF output as well. That's Pandoc under the hood. So Pandoc doesn't know R, but R Markdown makes it possible for you to include the R code and then pass it to Pandoc and take a rendered document and convert it to whatever you want it to be. And so Corto really tries to stay true to Pandoc and build off the Pandoc ecosystem. So all of the output formats that Corto gives you are ones that are enabled by Pandoc, and they are kind of committed to that like kind of purity a little bit. So that makes it a lot easier for the Corto user to not be stumbling between different packages and realizing like, oh, this one supports this certain feature that I like, or this certain, we have this metadata block.
Right.
And sometimes there's metadata that's specific to an output format, and then you miss it when you go to a new package and have to go into a new output format.
Right.
So there were all these like, kind of small sort of paper cuts is what I think of them. And they really build up over time in teams, especially. And so, it kind of, the feedback that I was often getting from users was that like, I want to just stick with the R Markdown package and knitting the HTML document because I don't want to have to learn a new package. And so that tells you that there's a learning curve for each additional package. And so Corto really tries to decrease the learning curve for each additional package, and then also, blow up the user base so that Python users can use it. And it's likely that, people who use Python aren't necessarily going to be cross-pollinating with R code and Python. They're going to be knitting their Python documents, but now they can have the same benefits that R Markdown users have always enjoyed. And then R Markdown users get the benefit of having a more integrated tool chain. It's just one thing that you have to install, and then you get access to all these different formats instead of a package per format type thing. So the way I see them evolving is that I think Corto is under heavy development by RStudio right now. And I think we will get to the point, because I was involved in these discussions early on, and I think they will get to the point where, there may not be new features added to existing R Markdown packages. Like, maybe you're waiting on some new fancy thing to be implemented in Distill. You mentioned Distill as one package, or, one of our slide making packages, or, Book Down, Blog Down. You might be hoping that there will be more innovations in those packages. That may not happen. There may be a point where the developers say like, hey, if you want this feature, it's been implemented in Corto because it was a cleaner way to integrate it. And, that's kind of where all of the development energy and effort is happening. So I think you'll get to that point, but I think I know that RStudio is going to continue to maintain R Markdown and continue to support R Markdown because there's a lot of people and teams who really depend on those stacks to be able to do the work that they need to do, and they've invested a lot of time and energy in doing that. So none of those are going away.
Sure.
But there's definitely innovations that can only happen in Corto because of the way it's written and the way they're kind of starting, or they really did start completely from scratch, but taking the lessons learned and trying to grab all the best of things from, I don't know how many years of R Markdown we've had, but since the original R Markdown package, it's been many years and many users and a lot of iteration and a lot of great features that have been added and a lot of, figuring out how is this, best used and most useful to most people.
That makes a ton of sense. Well, just thinking about back to R Markdown, if folks want to learn more, what are the places you typically tell people to go to learn about R Markdown and to get started with it?
Yeah, so there's an R Markdown website. So I believe it's rmarkdown.rstudio.com. I believe. I haven't referenced it in a while verbally, so I'm pretty sure it's .com, not .org.
To make sure.
So that's a really great launch point. But also, I think the R Markdown package down site, it's pkgspackages.rstudio.com/R Markdown. We do have a vignette there that I wrote up for getting started with R Markdown that really is my best of advice for truly getting started. There's a really great section in the R for Data Science book about R Markdown. It's towards the end because the authors cover it from sort of like, the beginning point that you're at in learning data science to communicate. So communicate is at the end, but it's actually one of the better introductions to R Markdown that I really like. And then also I really think that the book, R Markdown, the Definitive Guide, it has an early first chapter that gives you sort of like a whole game picture of how to use R Markdown. And especially if you're just getting started out, I really encourage you to stick with plain old HTML document as the output format. Don't try to go into any of the additional packages. So every additional package, what you kind of gain is, a new output format or multiple output formats per package. And you're gaining also an additional like kind of dependency. So usually they were things that they didn't want to add to the R Markdown base package, but wanted to give people the option to be able to use them. So, try not to get too fancy at first. Stick with pure HTML document, get your feet wet there and play with that first would be my best advice.
That's great. Well, if people want to learn more about you, what would be the best place for them to do that?
My website. My website is a pretty complete resource on me. So it's aprezhill.com. So APRESHILL.com. And I need to update it with my new job information. But it has a list of all the talks that I've given, along with slides and video recordings if they were available, and also links out to all my projects. And then a not well frequently updated blog. So I would say that I blog about every 6 months, maybe, when I get the time. I have a 5-year-old, so I'm not prioritizing that right now, but you can see some of the things that I've worked on both at RStudio and since then on my blog as well.
And just to point out to folks, your website is made with Blogdown, right? Which is kind of a related package to R Markdown obviously for making websites.
For making websites, yes. So I'm one of the co-authors of the Blogdown book. So Blogdown, Creating Websites with R Markdown is a great resource if you want to start pretending like you're a front-end developer. You can just kind of bypass the front-end developer stuff and just go to making fun, cool websites. It's pretty empowering, and if you're in the need for developing a personal website, it's a really great package for that.
Great. Well, I'll include a link to your website and the book in the show notes for this episode.
Awesome.
Well, Alison, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing about R Markdown.
Thank you, David. It was really nice to see you.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you learned something new about how you can use R. Do you know anyone else who might be interested in this episode? Please share it with them. If you're interested in learning R, check out R for the Rest of Us. We've got courses to help you no matter whether you're just starting out with R or you've got years of experience. Do you work for an organization that needs help communicating effectively with data? Check out our consulting services at rfortherestofus.com/consulting. We work with clients to make high-quality data visualization, beautiful reports made entirely with R, interactive maps, and much, much more. And before we go, one last request. Do you know anyone who's using R in a unique and creative way? We're always looking for new guests for the R for the Rest of Us podcast. If you know someone who would be a good guest, please email me at david@rfortherestofus.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.